Hi everyone, it's Jenny from the design team. Today I'm going to be showing you 5 different ways to use clear embossing powder on your cards. I'm using both matte and clear gloss embossing powder by Wow Embossing and 4 different card projects in total to show you. It's really amazing the different types of looks you can get just with using these 2 different embossing powders. And by the way, you can use either of these 2 embossing powders on these projects. I just wanted to show you that there were more than one type available. So to start off with, I am using black cardstock and we're going to do an enamel type technique. And what I mean by that is when you emboss on black or dark cardstock, it looks almost like enamel, particularly when you use the clear gloss with a very detailed stamp. So for this, I'm using the Rebecca Lace background stamp from Simon Says Stamp. You'll see that it's very, very detailed. And for that reason, I'm using the super fine clear gloss embossing powder. Now this embossing powder comes in regular, super fine and ultra high, and it also comes in those little jars you see there and the big jars. So they're all available from Wow Embossing. And I really do need to get myself one of the bigger jars at this point, I think. So I've treated my cardstock, this is Midnight cardstock from Catherine Pooler, with a powder tool. And then I've added my embossing powder using a coffee filter to catch it, and I'm heating it. That's all there is to it. Super fine, detailed stamp, glossy, clear embossing powder on dark cardstock, and you get this gorgeous enamel type look. All I did to finish it was add some Silver Rain Nouveau sequins and a You're So Kind die by Simon Says Stamp cut from holographic cardstock. Popped it up on foam squares. Now this next technique is probably my favourite to do with clear embossing powder, and it gives you the look of engraved metal. So I've got an A2 panel of matte silver cardstock here. You could also use mirror cardstock, any sort of metallic cardstock. And I'm using this Flourishes background stamp by Catherine Pooler. I like this stamp for this technique because it has a slightly more solid image, but you can try this with anything you've got in your stash. And I'm adding embossing ink as I did before, and I have also treated the metallic cardstock with a powder tool. And then I'm adding some clear matte embossing powder. I haven't tried this with the gloss. I think the matte gives more of that engraved look, but you can also try this with any type of clear embossing powder that you've got, and then just heat it up. I did stamp this image a couple of times, and I am using a Misty for this one. I use it throughout, but particularly for this one because the cardstock is more slick. You will notice there's quite a lot of warping on this cardstock, but you can flatten it out when you finish off your card. And look at that, it looks like the cardstock has been engraved. I just love it. Now to finish it, I'm going to show you a third technique using clear embossing powder. I'm back to the clear gloss this time. I've die cut this Hello by Erin Lee Creative from Midnight Black cardstock, and I'm pushing it down into the Wow Embossing ink pad. You can also use the refill roller for this technique as well. And then I'm just adding a layer of the clear gloss embossing powder. Now, you can get this similar look using glossy accents or Nouveau drops, but they take ages to dry, they drip. This is a great way of getting a super shiny sentiment for your card, and I did 3 layers on this card. If you've got the ultra high clear embossing powder, you will only need to do 1. So because I'm using super fine, I had to do 3 layers. And look at that, you get this gorgeous shiny die cut word, and it takes no more than a couple of minutes instead of waiting ages. And I just popped it up on the engraved metal card and added some more of those Silver Rain sequins by Nouveau. Now this fourth technique uses pattern paper, and it uses the clear embossing powder to trap the image underneath the embossing powder so you can see through to it. And I'll show you what I mean by this if you haven't seen it done before. It's a bit of a tried and true technique. I'm using this Hero Art marble background stamp, I again like this one because it has a lot of solid areas, so it's going to show you more of the patterned paper when you look through that clear embossing powder. I'm stamping it directly onto this pattern paper by Altenew and then adding my embossing powder, and I have again used a powder tool to treat the surface. This paper is particularly shiny, but it's also quite robust, it's quite thick, which is good for this technique. And there you go, you can see it doesn't look like much right now. So what we're going to do is add some ink over the top. And dark ink is usually pretty good for this technique. I tried it with the Distress Oxide Blueprint Sketch first off, and these aren't particularly easy to just take the pad directly to the paper, so I'm using one of the blender brushes just to get full coverage all over this pattern paper. And it looks a bit like a hot mess right now, but then you just come in with a microfiber cloth and buff away all of the ink that's resting on that embossing powder. It's a slick surface, it will wipe off, but it will dye the pattern paper and cover it over in the areas where there isn't any embossing powder. I actually decided to go back in, you'll see here, and use black soot over the top because I wanted it to be a bit more of a contrast between that bright image and the background. And I then added a fabulous die by W+9 die cut from Silver Glitter Cardstock, popped up on foam squares in the centre. Now this last technique uses a similar theory to the last card, however instead of using pattern paper I'm using coloured cardstock. So I've stamped this Rondi's Window background by Catherine Pooler onto some lavender cardstock, and I'm heat embossing it with clear embossing powder. And first off, you'll see this gives you a gorgeous tone-on-tone look. You will see this is lighter cardstock. It doesn't quite have that look of enamel like we did with the black cardstock. And you could completely stop here. Clear embossing powder has a great tone-on-tone effect. But I'm going to take it a step further. So I'm using Distress Oxides. These are obviously solid and opaque inks, so they will completely cover over any of the coloured cardstock that doesn't have embossing powder on it. I'm using a couple of colours here. I'm using Peacock Feathers, and here you'll see I'm blending on Tattered Rose. I actually change my mind a little bit and go with Worn Lipstick. And I'm using a blender brush. I'm blending it halfway in on the panel and then slightly overlapping in the centre. And that embossing powder is going to resist the ink. You just need to go back in with a microfiber cloth, buff it off, and you will see that the embossing powder now looks like it is the colour of the cardstock underneath. So you've expanded your embossing powder collection by as many types of colours that you've got in your cardstock collection. You'll see here I can just go back over the Tattered Rose with the Worn Lipstick and it just covers it over. That's because Distress Oxides are opaque. You'll also see there I added a little bit of water to some of the pattern just to see the reaction. It's really subtle. I finished the card with some Nouveau Crystal Gems, a stacked love die cut from Birch Press Designs, and the leftover U die cuts from the first card I made from holographic cardstock. And that finishes all the techniques. I hope you've enjoyed watching. Be sure to subscribe to Wow's channel and check out the other tutorials.